mention was does anyone remember GBA Video?
No.
No, nope.
Yeah, you don't remember
Is that
GBA?
like movies on the Game Boy Advance?
So GBA Video was like this incredibly short-lived, but like there was a lot of them that came out for it, but it was little cartridges that had like episodes of like TV shows on them, and they ran it like 2 frames per second, and like didn't look great. But
I'm surprised did we own it?
so I had one of them, and it was an episode. It was a Fairly Odd Parents one, and it had 3 episodes of Fairly Odd Parents on it. And I used to watch that in the car on car rides on repeat, despite it looking like crap. Yeah, they actually had full-on movies too. Like you could watch like Shrek on GBA.
Oh hell yeah! No.
But imagine it being like super pixelated and like.
Even better.
Yeah.
Hey guys, I'm Bill, a one-time Instagram blogger and now a podcaster.
And I'm Alex, the chaotic neutral,
And together we are the Gaming and Collecting Podcast
a brother-sister duo,
that talks about gaming.
and also anime.
And don't forget the collecting, sometimes.
Ah, forget it. We're just a nostalgia podcast at this point.
But anyways, guys, thanks for joining us as we discuss the games that shaped us. So, this is where I'd normally say, how you been? But we actually have a guest this time, and I'd like them to introduce themselves.
What's up? So I'm Dave. I'm the host of Tales from the Backlog. Thank you, Bill and Alex, for having me. Yeah, this is my show. Tales from the Backlog is a gaming show. It's a gaming review show about mostly backlog games. So, for an example, there, Bill came on my show and we talked about the Pokemon trading card game for the Game Boy Color. So backlog stuff most of the time. So yeah, that's my show. That's me. I'm Dave. There's nothing else about me other than my podcast. I don't exist in between recordings. So yeah, good to be here, guys.
No, thanks for coming on, dude.
Yeah.
So now I guess as we say in every show, how have you guys been?
It's been one of those days for me. Just everything at work went wrong. It was just one of those days, but oh well. You push on through and you hope tomorrow is a better day.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I saw like 3 car accidents this week, which is actually kind of tame for like our area because we're like right next to the city.
Mm-hmm.
And like right when we get out of work, it's like rush hour traffic. So that's just when all the psychos are out. And like, I swear, this was the first time. This was the first time I ever had a car accident like right in front of me, and I had to like slam the brakes and get out of the way.
No.
I was like, oh man.
Yeah, I always see weird stuff on that road. Like, I think on Monday it was 2-lane road, and some guy just tried to go in between the 2 lanes, like in the middle on like the dashed line, and I was like, what are you doing? Like, and of course I'm on the phone with our mother. Like I usually call her on my way home. And she's like, what's going on? What's happening? Because I'm like, holy crap. Like, so that was great. But yeah, our drive to work, to work is fine. Leaving work, not.
Yeah.
You know, I think everybody says that like the drivers where they live are the worst. You know, doesn't matter where you live. Your local drivers are the worst drivers in the world. But I've heard this is like the 9th time I've heard Bill talk about people getting in car accidents like on his commute. So I'm like, I think the Ohio drivers here are pretty good by comparison.
Yeah. Oh yeah, the mass holes are not good drivers.
No. I think usually the one like turnover from like that is like everybody thinks their drivers are the worst, except for Massachusetts drivers. They're their own special breed.
Okay.
But other than that, though, it's been pretty chill.
Nice.
Been kind of catching up on some games. Me and Alex are in we're marathoning all the Studio Ghibli films for a eventual podcast we're planning on doing.
Oh, sick.
Other than that, though, nothing too crazy. The 3DS store died. That was a big event recently.
Yeah, that was a big thing.
It did, yeah.
I remember because
What?
I had to teach like 5 people how to add currency to their accounts that didn't know. I was like,
Mhm.
because everyone was like, "How do you do it? It won't let me." I'm like, "You got to merge accounts. You got to go in through the website here, do this, do that."
Yeah. Yeah, they sure made it as difficult as possible to have people spend money.
Yep. And I'm sure they made like millions just off of like all the last minute buyers, but
Yep.
Oh yeah.
it's funny.
Imagine how much more money they would have made if they didn't make it really difficult to spend
I know.
money.
Like so many people just gave up because it was too much work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's funny though because I not in my life did I think the Vita store would outlive the 3DS store.
But it's still kicking.
Hmm.
PS3 is still up, and I think PSP is still up too because
Yeah.
Sony gave in real fast to everyone
Yeah.
complaining.
Nintendo's
Ninten-
like, nah.
No, Nintendo doesn't care. Like
No,
they
they
just
don't
do
care.
whatever.
Yeah.
Yep.
Mm.
And other than that, though, the only other major event that happened recently was E3 got canceled.
Yeah, that
Oh.
was just this afternoon as we're recording.
I
Were
think
Pretty,
they
the
like
gen-
selling tickets for it, or
they're
was it
trying to.
they were trying? Oh, I guess it wasn't going well.
Well, most of the people dropped out. Like none of the
Yeah.
big
Oh.
people were going.
Yeah.
Like even Sega and like Ubisoft dropped out, and they were kind of like the last like real major like stragglers that were hanging on.
Yeah.
Dang.
It's kind of not a surprise, and I doubt it'll ever come back just because
No.
the pandemic taught Nintendo and Sony and everybody they can just do it themselves. They don't need E3. So
Mm,
Yeah.
not surprising, but
yeah.
And even then by like this point, like everything was already online like days before the convention even happened. So it was like
yeah.
there's no surprise. Like we don't get any classic like 299 jokes or
Mm,
the Zelda reveal like trailer where everyone lost their shit, like all that fun
Mhm.
stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think the general consensus going around from everybody was like the Top Gear gif of like, oh no. Anyways,
Yeah.
Womp womp.
It's
Oh well.
like the one or two trailers that maybe would have made big waves from E3 would have been something to get excited about. We're just going to see those some other way. It's not like we're going to miss people announcing their exciting new games or anything like that. So,
yeah. Yeah, just a different time.
yeah.
But anyways, so I guess now we should shift over to our topic.
Mhm.
So for this episode, we're actually jumping back over to a console retrospective. We haven't done one of those in a while, or I guess in this case, a handheld retrospective. And in the past, we've talked about the DS, the 3DS, like because those were probably the two from our childhood that we really like connected with as kids.
Mm.
But another one that existed in that point, and I didn't actually realize just how short-lived it really was the Game Boy Advance.
Yeah.
Because I mean, the Game Boy Advance literally, it was here in like 2001, I want to say, and it was gone by like, well, it wasn't gone, but it was pretty much obsolete by 2004.
Is that when the DS came out?
Yeah, because the DS
Huh.
first released in 2004, and granted, the GBA still was around up until like 2006, I want to say.
Mhm.
But realistically, like, did anyone like? I'm pretty sure by that point, everyone just their DS became their new Game Boy because it had
Right.
the Game Boy Advance slot.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I believe the only real reason anyone would use a Game Boy Advance anymore was to play Game Boy Color games, just because the the DS for whatever reason wasn't compatible with the Game Boy Color.
Huh. Yeah.
Like the slot was like slightly different for whatever
Okay.
reason.
Gotcha.
So Game Boy Advance, this one is interesting to me because I remember vividly like when the DS came out, and I remember getting the DS like at launch for like Christmas that year. But my actual experience with it feels like very like it was here and then it was just gone. Like I don't know if like you had a similar experience, Dave.
Not for me really. So like we were Game Boy kids. So we had our first were Game Boy Pockets, and then we got Game Boy
Mhm.
Colors, and then as soon as we started seeing the advertising for the upcoming Game Boy Advance, it was like I don't know exactly when we got one, but we got one like pretty quickly. The latest it would have been was like whenever Christmas was after it released. Like I don't know what date it released, but like that Christmas would have been the latest we got it. So We had it, and then like I don't remember if my brother got one, but I got a Game Boy Advance SP, and then I didn't get a DS until like 2010 or something like that. Like I had the Game Boy Advance for a long time. I just didn't
Hmm.
like, I think the touchscreen thing from the DS was like, oh, I don't need that. I'll just keep playing Game Boy Advance. So I played I played mine a ton, like so much. It was at the time my favorite handheld, like by a lot, you know.
Yeah, the Game Boy Advance, like the one thing I do remember the most about it was like the summer camp handheld I had at the time,
Mhm.
where like because you'd always have to go to summer camp during the summer because your parents had to work, at least in our case,
Yeah.
Mhm.
and we couldn't stay home alone at the time, so we would go to this. It wasn't really a camp; it was more like you'd basically go to the school and you'd just be like, it was like the YMCA program they like to call it.
Oh yeah.
And so we were basically just stuck at the school with all the people we didn't like from the school
Uh-huh.
No.
during the entire summer. And literally, like the only solace like we would had was like our Game Boy. Like at least for me, it was like my Game Boy Advance, which of course they immediately banned Game Boy Advances because literally all the kids would just play Game Boy Advance the entire time,
Right.
as
Yeah.
children do.
Yeah, like I don't know how old it sounds. I don't know how old you are. It sounds like you're a little bit younger than me. I got the Game Boy Advance. I remember playing it in high school most of the time. So like
Okay.
I was home alone during the summer. I was working, like I had a job, so like I would play it on my breaks at my job sometimes, or like if I was just at home during the summer, not doing anything, not working, I was either playing Morrowind on my Xbox or I was playing the Game Boy Advance. And two different niches for two different, times for playing games, and so they both got like so much play. And it was really like my introduction to so many different types of games, because on Game Boy Color I mostly just played Pokemon and Mario
Mhm.
and Zelda and that kind of stuff. And then like the Game Boy Advance got a bunch of ports and a bunch of like cool original like IP, and I played a lot of those on there too. So it was like this big awakening for a lot of different genres, you know.
Hmm. Now, Alex, you had the special like hot pink see-through one, right?
I think it was hot pink. I think it was like a baby pink, but it was a see-through one.
Yeah, guys don't understand color, Alex. Sorry.
It was baby pink, Bill. Yeah,
Mhm.
I had that one. I don't know if we got them. If at that point we were getting consoles at the same time.
No, you got yours like a year later because you were
Okay.
still in that phase where like our parents didn't know if you liked video games or
Well, we
not.
got the DSs at the same time. I know that for sure.
Well, because
Um,
a little like future talk. The DS, you got the DS day one because you were obsessed with Nintendogs.
yeah.
Like you wanted to play
I
Nintendo.
wanted to play Nintendo so badly.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, the Game Boy Advance, I think like I definitely got it a year later, and I don't I don't remember if I asked for it or if I just saw you playing it, I was like, I want one too. I feel like that's probably what happened.
So
Um,
I think what happened was you saw me playing Pokemon, and I
yes.
think that's what did it.
Yeah. I'm pretty certain it was probably Pokemon because that the Game Boy
Mm.
Advance was my first Pokemon game. So
Oh,
So
which one was it?
I believe it was Leaf Green. Is that
Yeah,
yep. Yeah, Leaf Green. It was my first Pokemon game.
awesome.
First introduction to the series, and then I was hooked. And I've played every game after that. So
yeah,
Nice.
she likes Pokemon more than I do at this point. It's actually
Oh,
pretty awesome.
nice.
Like she's already beaten like Violet, Scarlet. So
Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a huge Pokemon fan too. I played so much I had Fire Red, and one of my early eBay purchases was buying Leaf Green on eBay, and it turned out to be a fake. So I plugged it in and it
Oh
didn't work.
no.
So that was fun.
Oh
It's my way, welcome to the internet, kid type moment.
no.
Um, but
I took
I
your
played
money.
exactly, yeah. I played Ruby and Emerald a ton too.
Mm.
Like
Emerald's
So
still
much.
my favorite Pokemon game of all time. Like I will,
Yeah.
if I'm literally at this point, I'm just like waiting for Nintendo to put those on the GBA app on the
Mhm.
Switch because I will
And
play
Mm.
I will play the
and
shit out of that.
yeah, not to go too deep down the Pokemon hole, but like ROM hackers have been using Fire Red and
Mhm.
Emerald, like that gen of Pokemon, to make ROM hacks.
Mm.
Because apparently I don't know if it's just the easiest to mod up or if it's just they've been working on it for longer than some of the other ones.
I
But a
think
lot of my
it's
favorite ROM hacks
mm,
are ROM hacks of Fire Red.
Hmm.
I think it's a combination of like anything like higher, like DS up, is probably more complicated to work with
Yeah.
Hmm.
because it's all the double screen stuff.
Hmm.
Um, Also, like Gen 3, in a lot of people's opinion, has like the best like battle mechanics out of any Pokemon game. So I think that might have something to do with it as well.
Mm.
Could be, yeah. It
I mean,
just seems to be like when a lot of us think of like what does a Pokemon game look like? I think a lot
mhm,
of us would default back to that like Gen 3 Pokemon GBA look,
Mm.
you
yeah,
know?
that was like the first gen where they didn't look like 100% ugly.
Yeah.
Oh
Yeah.
no.
The sprite work looked real good in those games.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I guess actually, before we talk more about like personal memories, I'd actually like to go back and talk a bit about the consoles or handhelds history.
Sure.
Do, do you remember Project Atlantis at all?
Doesn't ring a bell, no.
Nope.
So Project Atlantis was like kind of like the proto GBA. It never released. I think there's like one prototype that exists, but it was essentially like the overall concept was it was supposed to be like a 64-bit handheld that was like miles ahead of like the Game Boy or Game Boy Color, I guess at the time.
Hmm.
But it was like extremely like ambitious. It was gonna like completely destroy Nintendo's whole battery power means everything mentality
Uh
and and then the whole like key thing that also killed it was the Game Boy Color was still selling like nothing. Like they had no reason to like release this thing,
hmm.
especially if it was going to be a big money loser.
Yeah.
So it was kind of like a footnote in the history of the Nintendo handhelds that I don't think we've ever actually seen any of what it was capable of. But like there's like one prototype out there that appears. It looks kind of like a Game Boy Color, but like wider. But it's still like the vertical design, not the horizontal design that the GBA would go with.
Huh.
But going from there, the GBA itself is actually kind of interesting because it's actually a 32-bit console, not a 16-bit like a lot of people mistake it for.
Hmm. Yeah.
Because the GBA is actually, a lot of people refer to the GBA as a mini SNES, but it's actually kind of an insult to the GBA because the GBA is significantly more powerful than the SNES in a
Yeah.
lot of
Yeah.
ways. Because
Yeah.
it can
Just
actually, oh
sorry,
no,
just thinking about some of like the fully 3D games and stuff
mm,
that were on the GBA. SNES couldn't handle those, like not even
no.
close.
No, like I still think like the opening to like Kingdom Hearts Chain of Memories, I don't really care for that game that much. But that opening 3D like cutscene is damn impressive, especially when you realize it's on the Game Boy Advance.
Hmm.
Yeah.
There was other games that like there was a ton of full 3D like racing games that came out for the thing. Like I always think the Crazy Taxi in particular
Huh.
on GBA was pretty impressive. But what's funny about the GBA is do you remember what your first game was?
Um, for me, I think my first game was Ready to Rumble Boxing.
Okay.
With this weird boxing game. I just remember there was like a fat guy and there was a guy with a giant afro, and that's all I remember. But I
Oh
played it a
no.
lot because it was my only game.
See,
Mm.
I remember the Sega Dreamcast version of that game. I didn't actually
Hmm.
know it was on Game Boy Advance. That's
Yeah, it
like
was like a launch title for GBA.
Oh really?
so.
Yeah.
So I had the other launch title that gets completely forgotten these days, and that was does anyone remember Iridian 3D?
No, I
Nope.
don't.
So Iridian was like a 3D like shoot 'em up where like you kind of like it was kind of like a Star Fox kind of game where you were from the back
Mm.
and it was like this 3D space shooter, and I remember being terrible at it but being really impressed that it was in 3D. And I remember playing the hell out of that, and then I had Mario Advance, the original Mario Advance.
All right, remind me which one is that? Is that the remake of Super Mario Brothers?
So the first Mario Advance was Mario Brothers 2.
Okay, yeah, I had that too. I played that on Game Boy Advance because I never had an NES. So that's how I played that game, and I had a lot of fun. It was good.
It's actually a really good version of that game because it actually like fixes a lot of like the jank problems with that game.
Mm.
It's really funny to me, like a little tangent, but the Mario Advance series to me, I always thought was hilarious because it literally like there was 4 of them and they literally went Mario 2, World, Yoshi's Island, and then 3. Like
Huh.
what a wacky like release schedule. But
Yeah,
I always thought it was cool though. Like it's funny because there wasn't a mainline Mario game on the GBA. It was all
right.
ports. And
Not its own thing. Yeah.
the closest thing we got was like Mario and Luigi Superstar Saga,
Mm-hmm.
which is a full blown RPG.
Hmm.
So another thing I wanted to talk about was the handheld. the The Game Boy Advance had a lot of hardware revisions, and all of them are fascinating in their own ways. So obviously there's the original, like the GBA wide, which was the launch version, and I think not for nothing, it's the most comfortable version of the GBA to play.
Yeah, just especially especially if you're not 10 years old anymore.
Yeah.
Still, it's wide enough that it's not so uncomfortable to hold with adult hands for an extended
Yes.
period of time.
And it's
Yeah.
like the definitive like way if you're going to be playing like Game Boy Advance games on the GameCube with the Game Boy player,
Oh yeah.
because you can use the link cable and then you can just play with using that and not have to
Mhm.
deal with a GameCube controller or like squeezing your hands together with the second hardware model, which was the SP,
Yeah.
which I think is probably the most well-known version at this point, just because it was like it was like it was like the first for a lot of things for Nintendo. Like it was the first one with rechargeable batteries.
First one with
Like,
a backlight. That was the big deal. Like
well, it's funny.
Nintendo waited so long to
Mhm.
finally put a backlight in. Except there used to be a Game Boy version, like a Game Boy Pocket that had a
Oh,
light, but it was only in Japan, I think.
the Game Boy Light, I think it was called.
Yeah. There's a Japanese kid that went to school with us and he had one and we were all so jealous that he had one because we're over here like struggling to play after
Do-
dark.
Doing the classic like driving in the backseat of the car, like playing like
Try to
this.
catch 2 seconds of a street light.
Didn't
Yep.
we have like these add-on like lights that attached to them? Didn't we
The
have?
worm
I
light.
think
The
we
worm light.
did.
The
Yeah.
worm light.
Oh
They
yeah,
didn't-
those are essential.
They barely did anything, but it was what we
Hey,
needed.
Hey, it worked when you were trying to hide from your parents while you were supposed to be sleeping and you were under the covers.
You
See,
you went from having 0 light to having a light directly on the screen. It's like
See-
only a little bit easier to see.
Yeah.
See, this lets me know that Alex was the one that was playing Game Boy Advance with the worm light, and I had my whole full-on PS1 with the screen set up.
Right.
Priorities.
Yeah.
Yes.
But yeah, so going back to the SP though, I believe actually the first models didn't have a backlight. They actually had a front light, if that
Huh.
makes sense. Which is actually
okay.
I've read this because there's a later revision of the SP which has a proper backlight and has a like significantly better screen. And I think it has a lot to do with I guess the original models that was a front light or something like that.
Hmm.
But it's funny though because we talked about how like we were stuck with for years we had the no backlight like still battery operated.
Hmm.
I think the reason why it took us so long is because Nintendo was trying to figure out a perfect way to like keep their legendary battery life but also keep it rechargeable and like have the
Right.
screen. Because I
'Cause-
will
Mm.
the SP's battery, I don't understand how, but those things are literally indestructible.
Yep.
Like so a little like backstory, like we had moved a while back and I didn't have access to my collection for like months on end, and my SP hadn't been charged at that point in like almost a year. I picked it up like a couple days ago just like for some research for this, and it still works. Light's not even red. Like it's
Wow.
still good.
Yeah.
It's funny though because
What
everybody-
happened? My Switch dies so quickly now.
Yeah.
because Nintendo realizes no one actually takes their handhelds out anymore, and they just play them by the couch with the AC adapter plugged in at all times.
Hey, I don't.
Yeah, people like people want to say that, like, and I maybe I'm guilty of this sometimes too, of saying like, oh, the Game Gear had a backlight like 10 years before the Game Boy Advance SP. What gives? I'm like, well, the Game Gear took like 8 batteries and they lasted an hour and a half. That's what gives.
Yeah.
Well, it's funny. You could get, I think, like 6 hours on the Game Gear. The Nomad, though, you were lucky to get 2.
Mm,
Oh God.
I think the Atari Lynx was even worse. I think the Lynx was like 2 hours as well.
yeah. I think
But the
buying batteries for the Game Gear is the reason my dad started going to Sam's Club. Just got to get them in bulk.
Yep.
Otherwise, it's going to bankrupt the family.
Oh God.
see, at least like Sega was nice enough to let you plug the thing into the wall
Uh-huh.
with the AC adapter.
Not
That's the only.
Nintendo.
It's the only way to play Game Gear is plugged into a wall.
Yeah.
But so moving on, and then so we had the Game Boy Advance, we had the SP, and then there's the often most forgotten and most fascinating remodel of the GBA, and that was the Micro.
Oh.
I don't know a single person who owned a Micro.
No,
Yeah.
not me.
I don't. Do you have one now?
I do own one. I bought one right before they shot up in price because now they're like collector's items. Like for whatever reason, the Micro has become like this like fascinating piece of history with like Nintendo fans, and they go for like $200 now.
Wow.
But the funny thing about the Micro is it has quite possibly the best like screen I think a Nintendo console's ever had. Like it is really like clear and crystal clear. Sound is pretty good for it, and it's got decent battery life. The problem is though it's freaking microscopic.
Yeah.
I can't even picture this. Like, not only did I not own one, I don't think I've ever seen one. Game Boy
It's one of
Micro.
those things where it looks bigger when you don't actually have it in your hand, because like when you hold it in your hand, the thing is tiny.
Yeah,
feel
I
like
can see
your
that.
hands would cramp like after holding it because you'd have to be holding it in a weird claw situation really close.
It also came out at a really weird time because it was released after the DS was already out.
Yeah.
Okay, so for like a nostalgia collector type thing, like those little mini like Legend of Zelda things they release from time to time now.
Yeah. I think it was also like cheaper at the time than a DS. Like I think it was supposed to be kind of like the budget console.
Mhm.
But the funny part was it wasn't that much cheaper. And another thing about the Micro that kind of hurts it was they took away the Game Boy Color backwards compatibility, so it was strictly a GBA.
Oh, so that was
so-
it.
But you could still plug the e-reader into it, which is hilarious. But basically, because it wasn't that much cheaper than a DS, literally more people would just buy a DS because the DS could play Game Boy Advance games, and it was
Right.
better
And
in most pretty much
Nintendogs. No.
Yeah.
among Picto Chat. Picto
Let
Chat.
us
Oh, yeah.
let us not lose sight of the important thing. If the DS could play Nintendogs.
Nintendogs.
Yes. Yeah, that was funny though. I remember the advertisements for the Micro too. Like were like trying to rip off Apple at the time because like Apple, that was when Apple was going through their like hip and cool like.
Oh,
remember
like
us?
the Justin Long era of Apple
Yeah.
commercials. Okay.
Like where
yeah.
they were really trying to appeal to kids.
Mhm.
I remember because the Micro like screamed Apple at the time. Like it's like the most non-Nintendo like feeling Nintendo handheld. And now it's a collector's item, and I will admit though that there's one that's based off of the Famicom where it's like red with like the gold plate on the front to look like a
Yep.
Famicom controller.
Mhm.
I want one of those so bad, but they're so expensive.
Yeah, I'm looking. There's one on eBay I'm looking at. It's $200.
Yeah, I had the chance to get one for 50 at a flea market once, and I passed it up like an idiot.
Uh,
Oh,
I think I bought something else. Actually, I think I bought a fucking Lynx. I bought a Lynx. That's what I did.
and from that day on, you swore never to pass up the opportunity to buy anything.
Well, now I just buy 3DO stuff. So
Right.
Yes.
priorities. So getting out of that, going away from there, and getting back into like sort of memories, like
Yeah.
Alex, I remember like you probably because so me and Alex were like 6 and 5 when this thing came out, like
Hmm.
very young, and poor Alex. Like our mom did not understand video games for girls yet at this point. She was unfortunately the victim of constant shovelware and licensed games.
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah.
I did not. I think Pokemon was like my only like non-licensed game that I had on the Game Boy Advance.
Yeah.
Everything else was licensed games. So I remember having a Rugrats game. I believe it was Angelica centric. What a time. But then the
Mhm.
other thing I remember vividly was this Hi Puffy Ami Yumi game, which was this Cartoon Network show like that. I don't know what was happening, but it was like a band. And I remember playing the shit out of that game. I love it because it was like a side scroller beat 'em up. So and it was pretty fun. But that's all I like. I feel like everything else I had was just random games that you would play for 5 minutes. You'd be like, "This sucks," and
You
then
had,
you just never pick it up again.
I remember vividly you had this Barbie spy game.
Oh
And
yeah,
you
Fun.
couldn't get past. She couldn't get past the first level, so she was like, "Bill, can you get past the first level for me?" And I couldn't get past the first level because it was that bad. I was like, I looked at her. I was like, "You're on your own. Sorry."
And at that point, I gave up. And that one was put into the pile of never to be played again games.
Probably for the
Oh,
best.
yeah.
Yep.
But it's okay because I had Pokemon in the Puffy Ami Yumi game.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yes.
To hold me over until the DS.
So we kind of mentioned it earlier, but the GBA in itself was basically a haven of Super Nintendo ports, and it got a lot of those over the course of its existence.
Yeah.
Like I still remember to this day, like the first time I experienced Donkey Kong Country was on the Game Boy Advance.
Me too. Yeah. I had it for Game Boy Advance, and like I don't know if I ever played it over at a friend's house because I never had a Super Nintendo growing up, but that was the first time I owned that game. So that game for me, I was looking at the list here. The first time I played Final Fantasy VI was the Game Boy Advance version. And there's got to be more, but I don't know. What else was there?
Another great one was Zelda: Link to the Past, an
Oh
excellent
yeah,
port.
right. Yeah, same thing. First time I played that Game Boy Advance.
And that came with the awesome Four Swords minigame too, which became its own series in the long run. So that one was a classic. Donkey Kong Country 2 and 3 also released. There was also the classic NES series that was getting all those ports at the time. These were actually just straight up ports of NES games, from what I remember.
Yeah, I don't think I have as much experience with that, with the NES ports, other than like we talked about before, the Super Mario Advance series.
Well, actually, what I mean is like these are just straight up like
just
ports.
actual ports.
Yeah, like of like 8-bit games, which was kind of cool at the time because they came in like these gray cartridges that were supposed to match NES games. But they were very much just kind of a novelty item at most. The GBA was also like the era of like remakes and stuff because this is like where we got like classic ones like Metroid Zero Mission, which is
Pokemon Fire Red.
There's probably more. I'm blank. Well, actually, all the Mario Advance games in themselves. So another one that I played the hell out of back in the day was Mario Kart Super Circuit. If anyone remembers. So Mario Kart Super Circuit was basically it was Super Mario Kart, but it looked better and it had like it was basically like imagine like a weird like fusion between Super Mario Kart and Mario Kart 64. It is
like I did play it, but I don't know if I owned it. I don't remember much about it, but like I definitely did play it because I played pretty much every Mario Kart at some point.
Yeah, that was one of my first experiences I had with getting games stolen from me because of summer camp. They stole my Mario Kart Super Circuit and a Bionicle game for some reason.
Bionicle.
Yeah. I rebought that game recently just for nostalgia's sake, and I was like, wow, this was terrible.
Yeah.
Oh no.
Oh man.
Yeah.
So another key for like series, well not series, another key genre that the GBA really kind of brought out was role-playing games, because there was a
Hmm.
ton of role-playing games on the GBA. Notably, Golden Sun was one of the ones that saw debuted on the Game Boy Advance.
Yep.
Like the original, and I think the Dark Age was the second one.
Uh-huh.
Those were great. Those were made by Camelot, who was responsible for the Mario tennis and golf games at the time.
Right. And those kind of Mario and Tennis RPGs were also on Game Boy Advance, and those were awesome. Awesome
Those
games.
the funniest thing ever. Like, well, you wouldn't think a tennis RPG would be awesome, but it is.
Oh, it is. Yeah. And then it was one of the very few games where I made use of the link with the GameCube, because
Mhm.
you could import your player from the Game Boy Advance game into GameCube, and it was like an adult playing against small children. You just dominated after
Mhm.
all the RPG time you did. But Golden Sun was one of the first RPGs I ever played. It was that or Final Fantasy VI,
Mm.
non-Pokemon division. I had many Pokemon games under my belt by that point, but um, I really enjoyed Golden Sun. It's a game I'm kind of afraid to go back and play again, because I've heard some criticisms from people who've played it recently, and I'm like, yeah, that makes sense, and I'm not super excited about going back. But I did love it at the time.
I'd say it still holds up. It's very basic by today's standards, but it's still a very solid game for the time.
Hmm.
I'm trying to think. Another one I really remember playing a lot of was we'd mentioned earlier, but Mario and Luigi Superstar Saga,
Yeah.
which I actually played after I played its sequel, Partners in Time, ironically.
Hmm.
Which is funny because it actually, because Partners in Time is kind of a step back for the series, going from that to the original felt like a weird like step forward. It was funny
Mm.
in a lot of ways. Uh,
Yeah. Alex, what did you play on the GBA other than when you threw that Rugrats game in the trash?
I'm pretty certain I had a couple of honestly, a lot of my games were either borrowed from Bill or licensed games. So I'm
Hmm.
pretty certain I had like a Bratz game, which was the edgy Barbies.
Oh, right.
Um, I'm pretty certain I had a Cheetah Girls game. The Cheetah Girls, that was a thing. Um, Honestly, a lot of the games I had just weren't very good.
Yeah.
Um,
That's a
but
shame.
but hey, it introduced me to Pokemon, so I'm
mm,
grateful for it, for the
Yeah.
whole Pokemon, because honestly, I think that's literally where I spent most of my time. In the end, I just played Pokemon and played it again, and just kept
Hmm.
playing it because all my other games were terrible.
so you know,
Um,
there's actually one other game you owned, and I remember this one vividly because I own it
oh,
now.
oh,
Um,
okay.
you had this game based off of, for anyone remembers the old Lindsay Lohan film Herbie Fully Loaded. Um,
How could
Oh,
we
I
forget?
remember this one.
Alex got a Game Boy Advance game based off of that, and she hated it so much that she threw it at me and said, "This game sucks. You can have it."
Sounds about right.
And
That's the appropriate reaction, I think.
I still own
Honestly,
it to this day
I
too.
think half of my games, that's what I ended up doing.
Oh man,
Because I
they
bet I
really.
had some Disney games too, but yeah, well, it's just because I mean, I was also like very young.
Hmm.
And I think my mom was just picking stuff she thought would appeal to me, which at the time, Barbies, Bratz, Disney princesses, the Cheetah Girls, yeah, it's all appealing. Nowadays,
Okay.
not so much.
Right. Right.
Not at all. um,
I will
but
admit, I had my fair share of crappy licensed games at the time too. Like I had this Hot Wheels game, which was just Mode 7 racing, like in circles, and it was bad.
Uh-huh.
yeah,
I also had what was the? I had one other really dumb one. Oh yeah, I had the Beyblade games. Those
Beyblade.
Oh. Ooh.
they were
Ooh.
just Marvel. They were just Marvel Madness.
Oh
That's all they
god.
were. So they actually weren't that bad. They were just dumb.
Some good games that I remember playing. So I got like I said earlier, I got my introduction to a lot of like classic series through the Game Boy Advance. So the first Metroid game I ever played was Fusion.
Fusion's so
The
good.
first Castlevania game I ever played was Circle of the Moon, which is Fusion's really good. Circle of the Moon it's fine, but the other Game Boy
Circle
Advance Castlevania games are better.
Circle of the Moon's the one that's impossible to play on the original Game Boy, right? Because it's so dark, like you can't see anything.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I did back then because I definitely played it before I had the light.
I know one of them was like so dark that like when they made the second one, they made it super bright just so you could see it on the handheld.
It's probably that because Harmony of Dissonance is a lot brighter than
Okay.
Circle of the Moon.
That's my guess.
And one of the we were talking about the 3D earlier. One of the most impressive Game Boy Advance games that I played a lot was the Tony Hawk Pro Skater 2 on Game Boy Advance. What's Tony Hawk Pro Skater on the Game Boy was like this isometric, really simple version of Tony Hawk Pro Skater. On the Game Boy Advance, it was the game from whatever you were playing it on, like fully 3D, same levels, same camera, everything like that. It was just, lower resolution, but everything else about it was basically the same, and it was super impressive.
So actually, talking about Tony Hawk, it actually reminded me of another game that very similar, like ironically both owned by Activision now. Funnily enough, but Crash and Spyro on the Game Boy Advance.
Yeah, I played Spyro too. Yeah,
because Crash, the two Crash games I'm thinking of are The Huge Adventure and Entrance, and they basically, so Crash was already half a 2D game to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
So they basically just took all the 2D levels and just made a game around those for the Game Boy Advance. So it's just a strictly 2D game, but it plays just like a 3D Crash game. Yeah. And they're really solid. Like they use the pre-rendered graphics to kind of mimic the 3D, and it looks like really solid, great gameplay. It was literally like playing a Crash game on the go. And then the Spyro games were even better because they were like isometric and they were basically just Spyro games, but like on a Game Boy.
Yeah. I definitely played one of the Spyro games on Game Boy Advance. Yeah. Speaking of licensed games, games that were good. Did you play the Lord of the Rings games on Game Boy Advance?
So I won't lie, I'm not a huge Lord of the Rings guy.
Okay. So they're basically like little Diablo games. Where you just play through the events of the movies, the Two Towers and the Return of the King. I don't know if Fellowship had a game on there or not, but I played those a lot. Those were super fun. I just played them over and over and over again. Like Diablo, like isometric action, tons of loot. Cool. I just have this vivid memory of like being on a road trip with my parents, and I was playing that game and I was listening to the Good Charlotte album that was out at the time. I forget, Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous, like that era of Good Charlotte, and just like blasting that on my CD player, playing the Lord of the Rings, the Two Towers on my Game Boy. Good times.
So speaking of games that you wouldn't think would be good on Game Boy, but actually are. So me and Alex have mentioned these like in the past multiple times, and like we always like to praise them. But the Sims games on Game Boy Advance.
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't even know they were there. That's cool.
So they are the funniest thing. So personally, we have more experience with the DS version of Herbs, but it's basically identical to the Game Boy Advance version, just with more content. So I'll talk. They work both ways, but there was the Sims busting out, Sims in the City, and Sims 2.
Yep.
So it's the funniest thing because, like, obviously they could not put a social life sim
full on,
on a Game Boy. It just wouldn't work. They instead made them into like top-down action adventure games that are almost like RPGs.
Oh, weird.
Where like they have full-on dedicated storylines, and like you start the game and like you go through this whole designated plot till you get to the end where it actually has like a credits and stuff, and it's surprising, like, because they try to keep like the social aspects where like you still have to watch like your like motives and stuff, but like you're going around the town, like you're trying to like talk to people, like going through this whole story, taking quests. It's like the amount of effort they put into like what could have been like the laziest just like half-ass port ever just amazed me for the time.
They definitely put a lot of effort because it's still you have the same qualities of like you can still design your own room, design your character, not as in detail as the PC games, but you still kind of have that functionality for the fans who, like me, really enjoy the designing aspect of the Sims games, but also was quirky and fun and like a good surprise, I'd say, from the Sims series. You just weren't expecting it. Because you weren't expecting any Sims game on the Game Boy Advance is the all honest truth.
They had some wacky stuff too, like in the Sims busting out. There was literally like for like the first like 4 missions, there's literally a wild rooster that just runs around the game and just will straight up kill your sim.
Yep.
Well, quote unquote kill you. It knocks you out and you get sent to the hospital. But it's like the most like what the hell is this thing in like a game ever? Like someone thought of this.
I was just checking my shelf, like, because I found some old physical games in a storage unit in the summertime, and some of my Game Boy Advance games were in there. So I have
Nice.
both of the Zelda games, Link to the Past, and then the Minish Cap.
Oh, the
And
Minish
then
Cap's super good.
yeah, and that was one that was like when they just put that on Switch recently, and a bunch of people like came out of the woodwork and were like, "Oh, Minish Cap, that game's great." And I was like, "Well, I haven't heard anyone talk about that since the Game Boy Advance."
Yeah.
And then for some reason, Final Fantasy 1 and 2, which I don't even know how I got that, but apparently I have it.
It's funny how that works. Like you'll go through and be like, I don't remember buying this.
Yeah, it will, especially for I'm sure it happens to you all the time, but like I own like 20 physical video games. So for me to have one, it was like, where did that come from? Is kind of odd.
Yeah. That's funny. Like, see, I just keep. So GBA was like one of the last consoles out there to have like cardboard boxes for the games.
Yeah.
I'm still kicking myself to this day that I like threw half. Well, my mother didn't know, so she threw half of those away.
Oh
Yeah,
no.
I'm sure we did too. Like the ones I have are all loose cartridges, and I don't have anything that can play a Game Boy Advance game anyway, but cool to have, I guess.
Hmm.
No, I keep all my Game Boy Advance games in a tote, just like hidden under my bed. I have
Mhm.
there's no way to properly display GBA games.
Mm.
They're fun. They don't take up a lot of space, but they're like there's no like proper way to actually like arrange those things.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I was thinking about like social games and like kind of like those sort of RPG at the same time, and Harvest Moon was pretty big on the Game Boy Advance as well. I don't
Oh
know if you
Yeah.
yeah,
played.
I know. I love that series now, and I wish I had it at the time because I probably would have loved playing it as a kid.
So
Oh.
the Harvest Moon on Game Boy Advance is Friends from Mineral Town, which actually recently got a remake on the
Yep.
Switch, known as Story of Seasons: Friends from Mineral Town.
Yep.
I remember playing the hell out of that one though, like which was funny because like this was before like Farmville and like Facebook were a thing,
Mm.
and I always remember like when Farmville became a thing, everyone was like going crazy, like be like it's a video game, but it's farming, and I'm like,
Farming.
Harvest Moon was that years ago,
Yeah.
but it had
It
more to it.
already exists.
Yeah.
I remember those were the kind of games that you'd kind of just like play like and just you'd go on like binges with like for like days on end just farming in a game.
Yeah. I
And-
never played those, but one of my best friends, one of my co-hosts on my other podcast, he was always a big Harvest Moon person. I ignored him like all basically our whole life until Stardew Valley came out,
Mhm.
and I got like super hooked on Stardew Valley. And he was like,
Yes.
"Dude, I've been trying to tell you for 20 years. Like, this is what happens. They're great."
Now, Alex likes to go on like month-long Harvest Moon binges every now and
Oh,
then.
yeah.
Yeah.
I understand now. I get it.
Yeah, it's just so fun. You just get like you fall into that hole of just do it and you lock and you start and it's like 8 in the morning and then you look and you're like, oh, it's 8 at night. I've been playing this all day and I
Yep.
don't regret it for a second because it was great.
So another series that actually made its debut on the well, not debut, but it's like debut worldwide on the Game Boy Advance was Fire Emblem.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And the story of how Fire Emblem came to America, I always thought was really fascinating. Because originally, so the way everyone in America discovered Fire Emblem was because of Smash Brothers, because
Yeah.
of Marth and Roy.
Mm-hmm.
I read a report though that I guess at one point in development they were planning on dummying Marth and Roy out of Melee for the American release.
Oh,
And
like because they thought we just like wouldn't like them or something.
because we had never got games with them, they just kind of assumed that we would be confused by them, which we were, frankly. But
Yeah, but
it, it
But
it
it
doesn't
also
take.
gave questions of who
Yeah,
are
it
these
was. I mean, it's
characters? Let's find
the
out.
same with for a lot of people, it's the same with Ness
Mhm.
and Lucas. Like, um,
Mm.
because there's way more people say that they like Earthbound than actually played Earthbound on
Oh
the
yeah,
Super Nintendo. So, like, dude, can you imagine like where
oh
would
yeah.
Fire Emblem be today if they didn't put Marth and Roy in Smash Brothers? Like,
It
the interest, I don't think would have really been there.
it would probably be a dead franchise because Awakening probably wouldn't have taken off like it did, and
Yeah.
Awakening was going to be the final Fire Emblem game if it didn't do well. So,
Hmm.
but yeah, it's funny. Like I read that story, and I guess at the last minute, someone on the team said, "Don't bother, just leave them in." I'm going to assume Sakurai, but it might not, it might have been someone else. But it's funny because of that, so much attention got drawn to Fire Emblem that they finally just kind of pulled the trigger and were like, "All right, let's try putting a couple out in America, see how they do."
Hmm.
And that's how we got Fire Emblem 7 and Sacred Stones, which
Yeah.
wasn't my first introduction to tactical RPGs because I didn't play the series till Awakening, but from what I've heard, the people that did play those games like absolutely adored them.
Hmm. I didn't play them back in the day, but I did. I did try them because obviously Fire Emblem got more popular, and then after I played Three Houses, I was like, oh, I'll try the old ones. Surely I'll be able to do that. Those games are really difficult.
They are.
So the first tactics. Well, there's a couple of tactics games that I played on GBA, but the first one was Final Fantasy Tactics Advance, which was also difficult when I was as old as I was.
Yeah, the whole idea of like moving your units around and then like waiting to me always kind of confused me a bit.
Hmm.
And I remember as a child, it took a lot to get it to figure it out. But then once you kind of like you realize, oh, you have to arrange them strategically,
Yeah,
and then it
it's
kind of it clicked on me because then like in Final Fantasy VII, if you think back, there was like that weird tactical like Mount Condor game that you always played, and like I was like,
mhm.
oh, you were supposed to arrange them tactically.
Yeah.
I was like, it was like that big brain moment where you're like,
Uh,
oh.
hindsight, it's 2020.
I definitely got down with like the more, I guess it's not like tactics, but Mega Man Battle Network was a series I was huge into on the GBA.
That's
More
like
fast paced, you know.
it's one of the most interesting Mega Man side series because it had like 8 games or something like crazy.
Yeah. Looking at it, there's 6, and then they started to do the Pokemon thing where they did different versions of the same game, which I don't know why they thought that would work, but they did.
Yeah. Thankfully, that's coming out on a collection pretty soon, which is pretty
Mhm.
cool.
Yeah.
That wasn't the Mega Man I played. I played Mega Man in Base, which is actually a Super Nintendo port.
I've never
Uh,
even heard of that one.
It was like a side game. It was the last classic Mega Man game for like years up until they did 9 and 10 like
Hmm.
back in the day. It's the Super Nintendo version is better because like the GBA version has horrible screen crunch,
Mm.
which is a problem a lot of Super Nintendo ports had on the GBA.
Makes sense. Yeah.
Speaking of that, though, did you play the Sonic Advance series at all?
No,
No.
I got burned out on Sonic back because I had a Game Gear, and I played Sonic on that, and
Okay.
I decided way back then that I didn't like Sonic, so I never played another one.
Fair enough. So I'll just like say it quickly. Sonic Advance was actually a surprisingly really good series
Hmm.
because they were the classic 2D style Sonic games, and they were they
Right.
played. So Sonic Advance 1 and 2, them more so than 2 actually play just like the classic Sonics, like they have physics based platforming, like that same like style. The levels are fairly quick, but they also have like multiple playable characters. They were really fun to play. The third one, not so much, kind of was a mess. Then we also had Sonic Battle, which was literally just like Smash Brothers but Sonic on the GBA. That was another cool 3D style. So we had mentioned Sonic. I was trying to think. Oh, actually, another thing I wanted to mention was does anyone remember GBA Video?
No.
No, nope.
Yeah, you don't remember
Is that
GBA?
like movies on the Game Boy Advance?
So GBA Video was like this incredibly short-lived, but like there was a lot of them that came out for it, but it was little cartridges that had like episodes of like TV shows on them, and they ran it like 2 frames per second, and like didn't look great. But
I'm surprised did we own it?
so I had one of them, and it was an episode. It was a Fairly Odd Parents one, and it had 3 episodes of Fairly Odd Parents on it. And I used to watch that in the car on car rides on repeat, despite it looking like crap. Yeah, they actually had full-on movies too. Like you could watch like Shrek on GBA.
Oh, hell yeah. No.
But imagine it being like super pixelated and like
Even better.
Yeah.
Even better.
yeah, that was a thing. It's funny, those were actually hard programmed too, so that you couldn't play them on the Game Boy player because they didn't want you pirating the video files. Because that was a different time. I'm trying to think. Like there was other games too, like
one of my favorites was Wario Land 4.
Wario Land 4.
Yeah.
Super overlooked series, the Wario Land games.
Yeah, Wario Land 4 was like, I think like that was the one where they really just went all out weird with it. Like, because I remember that game is incredibly weird, but in the good way.
Yeah, Wario Land 3 was like, it's weird because it's Wario and he has his weird powers where he can turn into a bat or he turns really fat or something like that. But Wario Land 4 was like, oh yeah, we're going to push this in, like the music's going to be really weird, and you go through the levels and you like grab a key and then you have to escape every level and the music gets super scary. And then there's weird boss fights in it. Yeah,
I always remember that because like Wario Land 3 and 2, like Wario was invincible and like couldn't die, and it was more about the puzzles. In 4, they actually gave him a traditional like health system, so it was actually a bit more of a straight up platformer.
Yeah, it was.
I played the hell out of that one back in the day because I loved 3. I think 3 is still my favorite Game Boy Color game actually, but that's besides the point. Yeah, I played that. There was a ton of other like crazy like platformers too. Like I know Rare actually made they made this like Banjo-Kazooie game on the Game Boy Color. I remember too. It was like a isometric like top down one, but it played just like the N64 games, which was pretty fun.
Yeah,
Rare actually I think made more games on the Game Boy Advance at this point than they did on the Xbox, believe it or not, which is funny. So I'm trying to think, like, so the DS came out in 2004, and by that point, like, it was kind of like the end of like the Game Boy Advance like line, as like we knew it. Which to me, I always thought was weird because like for the longest time, like I think everyone just referred to the DS as like the Game Boy DS. At least back in the day, because like the Game Boy was just synonymous with handhelds at that point.
Yeah.
Like to the point.
I mean,
where,
that was like that was back when like your parents or like your grandma or something who doesn't know anything about what the real name, and like why would they really care about it if they didn't play? But they would just be like, oh yeah, handheld video game, that's a Game Boy. Just like the one plugged into the TV, that's a Nintendo.
Yeah. Or if you went a little bit later down, like every handheld was a Game Boy and every console was a PlayStation.
Yeah, exactly.
It was like the funny stuff like that.
Yeah.
I was looking like so you're saying like the DS came out in 2004. Final Fantasy VI, which again I played that on Game Boy Advance. That was the first way I played it, came out in 2006
Mm.
for the Game Boy Advance. So like years later, they're still doing it, probably because of the backwards compatibility.
Mm.
And if they've been working on something for a while, they'd just be like, put it on Game Boy Advance. They can play it on a DS if they have it.
Yeah.
Kind of a shame that the 3DS doesn't have a GBA cartridge slot. That
Yeah,
would be
I
nice.
I always wish that it did.
I mean, they got rid of it. They got rid of it with the DS after a while too, because the DSi didn't
Yeah.
have it.
No, yeah, my DSi did not have backwards compatibility.
Yeah.
And it actually made a bunch of games unplayable too, because a lot of them had GBA support. Like,
Mm.
I remember Pokemon Diamond and Pearl. You could actually transfer Pokemon from your GBA games via the cartridge slot.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Every now and then, which was kind of cool.
Oh, one of the other things about the GBA that we didn't bring up was the games that like needed like the rumble feature.
Oh,
And
yes.
if I was the GBA the first one to have like gyro sensor in it, or was
So-
it was on Game Boy? They had like the cartridge itself would have a gyro sensor. There was a Kirby game like that, right?
Yes, there was Kirby Tilt and Tumble.
Yeah.
So the problem with that one was, the way that it was designed was the gyro was only programmed to work in the Game Boy Color face up. And when we switched over to Game Boy Advance SP, because the cartridge slot was on the bottom,
Oh yeah.
the gyro was reversed, and the game was unplayable.
Mm.
There
Wow.
was there was Yoshi Topsy Turvy or Universal Gravitation, depending on what country you're living in. That one also had a gyro, but that one actually had programming in it that allowed you to switch the orientation,
Nice.
which was nice. That one was pretty fun, even though it was like really. So I've always said like gyro on a handheld to me has always been like the most counterintuitive thing ever,
Mhm.
because it's like, imagine like you're sitting on a bus and you're just doing like the gyro over there. Like, what are the people thinking? Like what is
Yeah.
he doing?
Those literally, I mean, still to this day, me playing Breath of the Wild handheld on a Switch, doing gyro stuff and like turning my Switch to an angle where I can't see the screen anymore. So it doesn't work. Stop doing it.
Yes. I always remembered that. Like, another. Do you remember those hilarious battery packs you could buy for like the original Game Boy Advance before like we got rechargeable batteries?
You mean
No.
just like a rechargeable pack?
Yeah.
Yeah, kinda.
So I had one for mine, and it literally looked like a tumor sticking out of the GBA.
Oh God.
Like, it was massive, and it like stuck out of the back of it, and you'd put it on this little stand to charge,
Mm-hmm.
which was kind of cool. But you'd be playing your GBA in public, and it would have this giant like dump truck sticking off of the back of it, and you'd be like, "That's what it looked like." It was pretty like it looked really sus with the original GBA.
Mm-hmm.
There was that. There was the obviously we talked about the worm light. I remember you could
Worm.
actually. Some people had made like there was like unofficial, but you could actually put like lights inside of the original GBAs.
Oh.
And I always like was sketched out by that, because I was like, what if the thing just bursts into flames or something?
Mm-hmm.
Hello.
Game Boys always had those extra peripherals where they were like magnifying screens too.
Yeah.
Which
Mm.
I never played with one of those. I was like, even if it's kind of small, I am not letting anyone see me play my Game Boy with a fucking magnifying glass in front of it, you know?
Yeah. So actually, we were talking about wacky games with like built-in like peripherals, and one of them that just kind of came to mind that was kind of like insane to me was does anyone remember Boktai?
I didn't play it, but
No.
I've heard a lot about it.
So I don't
yeah.
think Alex has heard about it. Boktai was a game where the gimmick was it was all based on like sunlight, so you'd actually put the game out in the sun, and it had like a solar sensor built into the cartridge to actually yeah. And
I
it
feel
would
like
actually
that wasn't good for your Game Boy Advance.
so they made there was like things on it that were like, don't leave it out for like in direct sunlight. You had to kind of like it, but no one followed those. But
Leave it outside
But
between
don't leave it outside.
between 9 and 11 a.m. and 4 and 6 p.m.
Yeah.
I think the
That's
implication. I think the idea was you were supposed to play it
I was supposed to
outside.
leave your home.
Yeah,
I was like,
yeah. You're supposed
no,
to play it
I don't
outside.
want to see nature. I
Yeah,
want to play
those are
video games.
Kojima games. So Kojima's ideas are some successful, some not.
I've wanted to play those just like to experience because like it seems like a really radical idea. The problem is though they're expensive and I don't feel like hashing out the money right now.
hmm
Did
Like,
you ever have? Oh, sorry, I got
oh no,
distracted.
go
I was
ahead.
gonna say, did you ever have the worm cam?
The worm can?
I found it when I was looking up accessories, and it's like a camera attached to your Game Boy Advance. And you can take and edit color pictures on your Game Boy Advance, upload them to your PC in editing, and email them to people. And it has unique spy cam mode. I just found it when I was
This
looking up stuff.
this looks unofficial. This looks
I
very
don't think it's I don't think it's real. I don't think it's like a Nintendo thing. But it looks fun. Maybe that's why they added the camera aspect to the it wasn't did the DS have it or was it just the DSi and then forward?
DSi onward. The
Yeah.
DS the DS introduced the microphone, another thing that I think is a horrible idea on handhelds, but that's
hmm
besides the point. No, the GBA had so there was the e-reader, which was essentially a card scanning device which allowed you to get like little mini games.
Oh, yep.
And I had one and I didn't know how it worked, and I never figured it out as a kid. Like you'd scan the card and literally all I'd ever get is read error, which I think most people did.
Bill, did you have the Pelican TV tuner?
No.
It's literally you stick your Game Boy Advance in it, and I think it's like the tuna TV. Like it has antennas and everything. I'm
So
finding the gold here.
the Game Gear had one of those, but it was actually licensed by Sega.
Yeah, I don't know, but it was $80. So nice.
So Dave, did you ever have the Game Boy Player?
No, it doesn't sound familiar.
So that was the peripheral for the GameCube that let you play the Game Boy games.
Oh, okay. I'm not sure. I'm not sure if we had that or if it was just, the link cable that you could plug in through some adapter, if there was like a port or something like that. We did do that because of, like I said before, the Mario Tennis and stuff. But I don't remember ever like playing games on the GameCube.
Okay. I was gonna ask just because like that was like as a kid like we didn't have GameCube, like we were PlayStation kids at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And I always remember like seeing the Game Boy Player and thinking that was like the coolest like idea ever, like playing the Game Boy games on the big screen.
Yeah.
And I was always jealous. Like I was like, damn, I want to try that.
Yeah.
Then come like years later after I get my GameCube, I realize why are the Game Boy players so expensive? And why is the boot disc even more expensive? Because it had a separate disc so it would boot up, and
Oh, right. Yeah.
scalpers like to split them up and sell them separately because
Oh, smart.
that's what they do. So finding one with both was very challenging at the time.
Mm.
I was
Yeah, I
thinking
never
of,
got into that. We did have fun playing Pokemon on the TV through Pokemon Stadium back on the N64, but other than that, we didn't really get into handheld up on the big screen,
it's actually a fun fact that I learned recently. Did you know you could actually? This was never like released to the public, but there was actually ways to play Game Boy Advance on the N64.
Huh.
So there was a peripheral. It was strictly a Nintendo thing. Like this was for like demoing and like this was essentially how they got all the Game Boy Advance footage back in the day for like ads and like demos and stuff. They actually had a device called the Wide Boy 64.
The Wide Boy.
So the Wide Boy is actually a big part of Nintendo lore because it goes back all the way to like the NES where it was like a thing that was designed to like capture footage for demos and like promotional stuff. and they had one on the Super Nintendo that was designed to play the Game Boy games, which I think actually ended up becoming the Super Game Boy at one point. But there was one on the there was actually a couple versions on the N64. Like there was one that played Game Boy Color games, and then there was actually one that played Game Boy Advance games. And they were never released to the public, but you do occasionally see them pop up on eBay every now and then. And I always think like that would just be a cool piece of like history just to like come across one day and be like, wow, like this was not supposed to make it out.
But it did.
Yeah, I just thought that was kind of neat, like the way that they used to. That's how they would like capture that stuff back in the day. So, interestingly enough, I didn't realize this, but the Game Boy Advance only sold like 81 million. Well, only sold 81 million. But,
Interesting.
Yeah.
It's funny because its immediate successor and its predecessor both actually outsold it by quite a bit. The DS itself is the second best-selling video game system of all time,
Yeah.
which I always found interesting because the DS. I think the DS was literally the point where like Nintendo like cemented themselves as the handheld kings.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yep.
Because I mean, if you actually think about it, like what was the competition for the GBA? Like, because the GBA actually did have a few quote unquote contenders. Like, does anyone remember the N Gauge?
No.
I've heard about it, but wasn't there like around that time like Neo Geo had some kind of handheld thing?
So Neo Geo had the Neo Geo Pocket Color, but I believe they gave up on that once they saw the GBA and just realized they couldn't compete.
Yeah.
Was the Wonder Swan out?
So the
before?
Wonder Swan was also out because, believe it or not, actually this is a good segue.
Yeah.
The Final Fantasy ports of 1, 2, and 3 are actually not 3, 1, 2, and 4 are actually based off of the original Wonder Swan versions. Because the Wonder Swan was actually a pretty powerful little handheld. So the Wonder Swan, for people who don't know, was actually this. It was a handheld created by Bandai and designed by Gunpei Yokoi, the creator of the Game Boy. Shortly before his untimely death. And it went on. It never released in America, but it went on for quite a while in Japan until I think the early 2000s when they realized it just could not compete with the Game Boy because nothing can compete with Nintendo in the handheld scene.
Yeah.
But I thought that was interesting. Like a bunch of like GBA games are actually just ports of Wonder Swan games.
Oh.
That's funny.
Yeah, I didn't know that. It could maybe just because like it didn't sell as many as the ones that came before and after, just because it wasn't out for as long.
Yeah.
And I think that the DS, like the Nintendo tapped into, like they found a way to make sure that every little kid got a DS, you know? And so that's why that one sold so much. But
yeah. So another thing too that I was like thinking about too was the system, going into the hardware of it a little bit. The system was infamous for its sound card at times, which I think was very much directed. Well, so because the system is essentially a souped-up Super Nintendo, and the Super Nintendo famously used a Sony sound card, and of course, by the time the Game Boy Advance comes out, Sony and Nintendo are no longer friends. Sony basically said, "No, you cannot use that." So Nintendo basically had to make their own sound card, and that's actually one of the reasons why GBA sound was so different. I don't want to call it bad because there are, not for nothing, there are some awesome GBA soundtracks. Like
it's definitely not bad, but it's one of those where if you like just listen side by side, like if you're just playing a Game Boy Advance game, like a Metroid or something, you won't notice it. But if you like again, Final Fantasy VI, it's kind of people there's a lot of versions of that game, and the thing people say about the GBA version is like better translation, some bug fixes, stuff like that, but the music's just not as good because it can't on the Game Boy Advance compared to even the Super Nintendo.
Another like big one was like the Zelda Link to the Past was notable, had a
Mm-hmm.
Much different soundtrack. And then there was actually one of my favorite ones was Donkey Kong Country 3, where the soundtrack was just 100% different.
Oh.
Because apparently
Oh, no.
Donkey Kong Country 3 had a very like deep and like moody sounding soundtrack for the most part, and a lot of those like pitches and ranges could not be made on the GBA effectively.
Hmm.
So they made a new soundtrack from scratch on the GBA, which is hilarious because it actually like some of the levels don't fit at all anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's a level in Donkey Kong Country 3 where it's like literally a saw blade is cutting a tree in half like from the bottom up,
Mm-hmm.
and you have to
Mm.
like avoid the saw blade. In the Super Nintendo version, it's like this really dark and moody like track, which is supposed to be like bring like tension. If you listen to it on the GBA, it sounds like you're hanging out at the beach. Like it's the like this little poppy like upbeat like jolly song, and I'm like, huh. I don't think they thought about the level placement when they composed these.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I always thought that was kind of fun because a lot of developers did a lot of really cool stuff with the GBA. Like that was like such an innovative era for like handheld gaming, because when you think about the Game Boy Color and regular Game Boy, like a lot of those games were very good, but very much just kind of NES games on the go.
Yeah, or
And it,
just very limited in what they could do
mm,
because those it's just not the most powerful system. So you had a lot of platformers and turn-based stuff
mhm.
like Pokemon and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Even the stuff that like you could make like a direct analog from like the NES even to the GBA. It's like the screen is so much smaller and everything. It's just they just couldn't do a whole lot. And Game Boy
Mm.
Advance, like it that was one of the times. It's happened lots of times, of course, as you play lots of video game systems, but the GBA was one of the times when the day before I got the GBA, I was playing my Game Boy Color, and then I got the GBA and booted it up, and I was like, "Whoa, this is next gen." I didn't
Oh
say
yeah,
that, but I was like, "This is awesome." Um,
the
yeah,
the GBA startup is still one of the most iconic. Like the letters like flowing across the screen.
yeah.
Mm.
This era of Nintendo, they had the startups, they had the GBA and the GameCube, iconic.
hmm So one other thing I wanted to ask was, did you ever do any like link cable stuff?
Only for Pokemon.
Okay.
Only for
Yeah.
Pokemon.
Yep.
It was slow as fuck too. It was the most hilarious
Oh,
thing ever.
and it was God help you if you had a link cable that was not like in the best shape because
Mhm.
you'd have to like press it and hold it in or like hold it at the angle that it
The
worked.
perfect angle.
Yeah. But then
Yeah.
like Bill said, like the connection and the transfer was really slow. So it would be like
You'd have to hold it
everyone hold
for.
still for like 30 seconds. Don't move. Otherwise it's gonna screw up your trade.
Or even worse if you were doing a battle.
Yeah.
Oh
Mm.
man, just imagine like that, but like imagine like an already kind of slow Pokemon battle, but even slower. And like
Hmm.
if you jostle the cord a little, like it's just communication error, like end.
Hmm. Yep.
Oh no.
So what was fun about the GBA too is you could do up to 4 players on some games.
Hmm.
And I remember the trailer like to showcase like, oh, you can be in a car in the back seat with the 4 cords like spread across.
Yeah, because that'll work.
Oh yeah.
Uh, so believe it or not, like when we were on like a field trip once, we actually did this on the bus.
Oh, nice.
It was amazing and awful at the same time.
Oh god.
Like literally, it kept like disconnecting on at random points, and like the funniest thing too is we were blocking the aisle because we were going across the freaking aisle with the cords everywhere,
Mm.
and the bus driver was like, "You can't do that. Please stop. Oh, you're not going to listen to us. Okay, I'm just gonna continue to tell you to stop."
Yeah.
It was funny though because I was like, "Wow, we're doing the thing from the commercial."
Oh yeah.
We're doing the
Now you have to
thing.
have to take your Switch to a rooftop party to replicate that feeling.
Oh
Yeah.
god, no.
See, this was also the era where like Nintendo was still in that awkward phase of commercials before they got like really safe with like the Wii era commercials.
Mm.
Mm.
Because there was some funny ones on this one. Like I always remember the Mario and Luigi Superstar Saga commercial where they literally had like two kids like cosplaying as Mario and Luigi, just like throwing like sand and shit at each other in like their backyard
Oh, no.
to imitate the bro mechanics of the game.
Mm.
I thought stuff like that was funny, where it's like all this effort. It's not as weird as the Kirby DS commercial, which had Kirby with the finger touching the DS. If anyone remembers that.
No.
That was before Nintendo just went with the extra safe route. But
Mhm.
Oh god.
oh, it's funny to me though, because like I keep saying this a lot, but like the DS literally was like literally a flash in the pan. But then again, that entire era was kind of a flash in the pan in a lot of ways.
Oh yeah.
Because like even like the PS2, Xbox, and GameCube were, in the grand scheme of things, were pretty short lived.
Yeah.
All things considered. I mean, 2001. I mean, PlayStation was out in 2000, so like 1 year earlier. But they were all pretty much done by 2006 at the most. And I mean,
Yeah, that's true.
I think the DS is like, because I always forget the DS came out as early as it did at times, because it was like
Yeah.
2004 was early.
Yeah, same. I was still playing my GBA. Didn't need a DS for a while.
I remember the DS came out and I was still in elementary school. Like, so
Yeah.
that'll show how early that was. But
Mhm.
God, I was, one thing I remember too that I kind of missed from a nostalgic standpoint, not from a logical standpoint, was I kind of missed like the batteries and like the constant struggle of like
I don't miss that at all. You're a crazy person.
it was kind of nostalgic at the time. Like
Oh, it's nostalgic spending so much money on batteries.
let's be
Yeah.
fair, we didn't pay for them as kids.
Yeah, exactly.
Mhm.
That's why you're no.
I don't know. I always thought it was like there was always the
I'd
funny
be
like
more nostalgic about like the little worm noodle light or something.
right. Let me finish my point I'm going
No,
for here.
your point is invalid.
I'm not so much saying I miss the actual like idea of batteries. I said I miss more of like the atmosphere at the time. Like there was always something really funny about being on like the school bus and you'd have the one kid who'd be like, "Shit, I'm running out of battery. Like I need to
Mm.
save," or like you couldn't just like close the screen or like just go into sleep mode. Like the whole like you're on this like indefinite timer and there's like no way of like escaping your inevitable fate.
Oh, yeah, there were definitely times
Yeah.
when I was playing my Game Boy, and like something happened. It was like, well, I'm just gonna put this in my book bag and hope the battery lasts until I can check it and continue. Because
Uh-oh.
games didn't really auto save and stuff like that. So,
True. I
and I
kind of
am,
forget about that. Yeah.
yeah, and I am not nostalgic for that, for the record. It's just a memory I have.
Memory.
What I
A
am nostalgic
nightmare.
for,
No.
yeah, I am nostalgic for like it sucked being tied to batteries, but I did like it when my handhelds had battery life for like tens of hours. That was awesome.
Hmm.
I think the original Game Boy Advance actually had like up in like to like almost 30 hours of battery life.
Yeah, it was a monster.
It was
And like
insane.
my 3DS still gets really good battery life, but like the Switch, the Steam Deck, those things, they're doing too much. You're never going to get good battery life.
Yeah,
Yeah.
even the Vita has better battery life than the Switch,
Mm,
which is both sad and impressive, I
Mhm.
guess.
yeah. I also do miss like the whole. Mine was the clear one, and like that was very like 2000s of the time, having all the
Yeah.
clear see through. So I'll be nostalgic about that. Batteries,
Yeah.
no.
It was
Clear.
that's gonna be a running joke now forever. But
I'm just gonna throw batteries at you the next podcast.
I was gonna always say though, like this goes back to like Game Boy Color as well. But like you were the cool kid in town if like you had the atomic purple Game Boy Color like that was see through.
Mhm.
Mm.
Yeah,
wasn't-
same with the N64 controllers were like
Mhm.
that. Absolutely.
Game Boy Advance was, I think the only one that was like that was the pink one. Actually, now that I think about it.
The purple?
No, there's the purple one too because I had
Oh,
the
was
there?
purple one that was
Okay.
see through. Yeah.
Yeah.
I still have it. It does not work. And it has dog tooth marks all over it. But yeah,
So I had the basic white one, which was boring, but I still kind of like it.
Mm.
I actually lost my battery cover for it like years ago, and I found one
Oh
on
yeah.
eBay. I found one on eBay that was like a replica of it. I was like, oh, that's cool.
Oh, I played my Game Boy Advance. I lost the battery cover years before the thing stopped working. Because I think I left it outside, like in the rain or something. But I played for years with just duct tape covering the battery compartment instead of buying like a replacement cover.
You had to do what you had to do.
Yep.
Uh, that was so. It's funny though, because that was like to me like because the DS felt more like a. I don't know why it changed during the DS era, but the Game Boy Advance era was like the last era of like the true, I guess, like intended handheld feel to me, like where people actually went out and like played like at the park or like the school bus and stuff like that.
Mm.
I don't know if it's because the DS was more expensive and you didn't want to risk taking it out.
I feel like that definitely adds to it, the whole expensive factor, because like there's no way like I would go, especially with my Switch now. There's no way I'd like go out in public in like a park and play my Switch because I just feel like I'm asking for someone to just steal it from me. So at least like the Game Boy Advance, it was compact. You could kind of put it in your pocket. You know, you could hide it somewhere, put it in a bag. But especially, I think the money factor, like that's a lot of money you're carrying around, the DS and the Switch. So
Yeah. I don't know. I saw just so many kids with DSs, like in, doctor's office waiting rooms and stuff like that.
Oh, yeah, that's
So
true.
true.
there's that. I take my Switch to work with me every day, play on my lunch break. I don't go sit in the park with it because I'm not an idiot, but like I do take it portably. Just buy a case. It's not a big deal.
Yeah,
Um,
I do
I don't
have
know.
a case.
I feel like the intended experience with handhelds of like taking it everywhere just kind of as you grow up and you have less places to take a portable game
Mm.
system, that just kind of goes away. But I see kids playing their Switches and stuff
Oh,
around.
gives me
Yeah,
anxiety when I see them doing that because I'm like, that's so much money.
Yeah.
yeah. I do remember. I did have that kind of like nostalgic feeling though when I went to a store like right after the Switch came out. I think I was at like a Panera Bread or something, and I was in line, and I turned around, and the kid behind me had his like Switch, and I was like, "Wow, like we've really hit the point where kids are just taking the console with them now."
Hmm.
Yeah.
Like it was a fun little thing because it kind of gave me that nostalgia because I still remember like waiting in line with like our mom and just having the Game Boy Advance playing
Yeah. That was the
something.
thing. That was the thing that's gone now because the DS was bigger. The Switch is big,
Big.
especially for a kid. Like the Game Boy Advance could, and I guess the DS could too, but you could just like put that in your pocket
Hmm.
Yeah.
and pull it out and play in line or something like that. If you had to go with your parents to the bank or something like that, you could do that. And the Switch, not so much.
I think one of my favorite memories was we went to it was either a Home Depot or a Lowe's with our dad. He was working on a project, and I just vividly remember me and Alex sitting on one of those little hand trucks, just playing Game Boy Advance as
Nice.
our dad rolled us around the store looking for stuff.
Yeah.
I have vivid memories of that one. Like
Mm.
Yep.
that was just a different time. Like nowadays, you just don't see stuff like that,
Mm.
which is funny. Um, but I guess like we've kind of gone over pretty much most of the key points. Like, did you have any other things you wanted to bring up, Dave? Or
No, not really. I think I talked about the games I want to talk about and the memories that I had with it. Like I
Mhm.
I think that the Game Boy Advance came out like at the perfect age for me. Uh, just as you get older, you tend to have more nostalgia, or at least I do, for stuff like when I was in high school, basically, or
Mhm.
like maybe a little bit before that. And that's right at Game Boy Advance time for me. It came out in 2001 or something like that. So I was 13. A perfect time to build nostalgia. So I will always, and like I said at the top of the show, like this is the console that introduced me to so many
mm,
series, singular games too, but like my introduction to so many series like Metroid and Castlevania and Final
Mhm.
Fantasy and um Mario to some extent, and like continuing to play Zelda and stuff all on Game Boy Advance, and of course continuing my lifelong Pokemon addiction too.
Mhm.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh yeah, no, it was for me too. It was the start of my love of Pokemon. So,
hmm
as much as I had a lot of not so great licensed game, I did have Pokemon.
Yeah.
So, and I
That
still play Pokemon to this day. So,
that was actually my
not Bill.
favorite. No, I'll still play Emerald to this day because I love Emerald.
Yeah,
But
those are good.
I will say though one of my favorite things to do back in the day was because the Pokemon cartridges were colored. You'd be walking through and you'd see the kids playing their Game Boys and you'd kind of look at the back and be like, ooh, ooh, they're playing Pokemon. I need
Yeah.
to talk to them
Yeah.
because
Friend.
you'd see that bright blue or like red or green cartridge and you'd just like be
Mhm.
like immediately like someone who's playing Pokemon. We can trade.
Yeah.
I want my Alakazam or whatever trade evolution
Yep.
one he needed. And then they trade with you, and then they just run off, and then there goes your Pokemon.
hmm
Because children are great.
Well,
So I guess one final question: like, what was your favorite game?
Ooh, let me think about that. We'll let Alex take that.
Pokemon. Leaf
Okay,
Green.
we've been over that.
Yeah.
Which Pokemon was it? Was it Leaf Green?
Yeah, Leaf
Yeah.
Green. 'Cause
Okay.
that was my first introduction to the series. So,
Can't go wrong.
and
Um,
the only game I'm really nostalgic for on the Game Boy Advance.
So
honestly,
my
I could probably put together like a top 20 of like Game Boy
yeah,
Advance games that I really love, but yeah, I think it's got to be Final Fantasy VI. Like, I'm actually playing that right now. I'm replaying it along with Pixel Project Radio, what they're doing over there. Um, and this is my third time playing it. It's my first time not playing the Game Boy Advance version, and I still love it. Like, it's one of my favorite
Aw.
games. It holds up super well. And I played it for the first time on the Game Boy Advance. So like people know that game. All those story moments that are so like shocking and affecting, that was the Game Boy Advance that gave those to me. So it's probably my favorite.
it's a
But
top 5 Final Fantasy definitely.
yeah, if we're gonna go with games that like are only on Game Boy Advance, like not ported everywhere, Wario Land 4 is really great, and Metroid Fusion probably. Castlevania Aria of Sorrow, that's a top 3.
Definitely.
Nice.
For me, it would probably be Mario and Luigi Superstar Saga, like
hmm
just great RPG all around, like memorable story. Pokemon Emerald, of course.
Yeah.
And then another one that I just like always would go back to would probably be this is where it's probably a little bit tougher. Probably nah, I don't want to say Donkey Kong Country because that's a Super Nintendo game. Um yeah, I'll leave it at those two for now. I'd have to think about that more.
Can't go wrong with those two.
Hmm.
Yeah.
I was about to say Lunar Legend, but that's also not that's not an original game either.
Mm.
All right, so pretty nostalgic talk, all things considered. I guess
Yeah.
before we wrap this up, do you want to plug all your stuff again, Dave? Or
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, so I have a gaming podcast called Tales from the Backlog. Like I said, it's a weekly review podcast, but we're not reviewing the new games most of the time. It's mostly stuff out of my backlog, not necessarily retro, mostly not retro, but sometimes we do go back into the past. Have I done any Game Boy Advance games on the show? I don't think so. If I think about it, I might have missed one, but anyway, yeah. So backlog video game reviews. The reviews are no spoiler for a long time. So if you want to listen to an episode about a game you've never played, don't worry. We're not going to spoil it until we like yell at you to get out of the podcast because the spoilers are coming. Like I said at the beginning of the show, you're listening to this show. You obviously like Bill. So Bill was on my show a couple times. One, we talked about the Pokemon trading card game, the Game Boy Color game. And then you were on the episode about long games and burnout.
Yep.
Too. Yeah.
Go
So
on.
that was a good discussion we had there. So that's Tales from the Backlog. And I hope you come check it out, give it a shot. And thank you, Bill and Alex, for having me.
No, thanks for coming on, dude.
Thank you.
Thanks for being our guinea pig for the our first guest console retrospective.
Oh yeah, of course.
Yes.
Happy
still
to
kinda-
talk. When you said like you want to talk about a console, I had to think about it for a second, but the instant I was like, wait, Game Boy Advance. Can we talk about that? So yeah,
The
I'm
funniest part
glad to
was
be here.
well, the funny part is I went and checked the list and I was like, crap, I didn't even put it on there. So I was
Right.
like, all right,
Whoops.
add that in there.
Yeah, that's how excited I was. I'm putting stuff on the list that wasn't there.
Nah,
Yeah.
you're always welcome to come back on anytime. That list is still public, so if anyone ever wants to drop in. It's funny you mentioned the spoiler thing, and I always laugh because our episode was the one game with like
Yeah.
literally no
This
no
is the
plot.
one where we're like, there are no spoilers for the Pokemon trading card game, so we're gonna talk shop for like 10 minutes and then end the podcast.
Yeah, and then talk about the sequel that never came out over here that actually had a plot.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, that was a great episode though.
Yeah. Yeah. It was a good time.
The coin flips, man.
Mhm.
But all right. Anyways, guys, once again, thank you for joining us on the Gaming and Collecting Podcast. The Gaming and Collecting Podcast can be found on all your major podcasting platforms, particularly Apple Podcast and Spotify. We are made on Anchor doesn't exist anymore. Spotify for podcasters. And you can follow us on Instagram, Twitter, all the stuff, Linktree / The Barber Who Games. And you can join our new public Discord server, which is now open. And once again, guys, thank you for joining us, and we will see you all next time.
Bye. I'm tired.